"Dad, change of plans. Sarah's mom isn't feeling well, so this is just going to be a family-only trip. I'll explain later." The message popped up on my phone screen just as I was standing in the middle of the port of Miami, suitcase in hand, my shirt ironed, the sun hitting the wrinkles on my wrist like they were grooves carved by time. Just the family. Those 3 words. Colder than the ocean breeze. All around me, people were laughing, taking pictures. Kids were screaming with excitement as the cruise ship, white and gleaming, prepared to set sail. I'd been smiling like that in my head for months, waiting for my first trip with my son and grandkids. But now, in the middle of the crowd, I suddenly realized I was the one who didn't fit in the picture. Me, Ernie Miller, 65 years old, a widower for 10, a retired carpenter. I always believed that the effort of raising my only son to be a good man was the greatest pride of my life. I worked for 40 years, no vacations, no sick days, just so my son could go to college and have a home of his own. And now I was standing under the blazing Florida sun, holding an unused cruise ticket while my family boarded without a single look back. I looked up and saw Ryan, my son, on the deck. Next to him was Sarah, his wife, and my 2 grandkids, Mason and Julia. They were laughing, waving at someone out of frame, someone who wasn't me. I don't know if Ryan saw me or if he pretended not to. I just stood there, frozen, like a stone statue amidst the ship's long whistle and the loud goodbyes. The phone in my hand vibrated again. "Dad, don't be mad. When I get back, I'll explain, I promise." I smiled, but it wasn't a smile of forgiveness. It was that dry smile, like wood cracking after being left in the sun too long. I had nothing left to say. Every father has a moment when he realizes he's become an inconvenience, and this was mine. I walked slowly toward the exit, dragging my suitcase over the hot concrete, the smell of salt water mixed with the smell of diesel fuel, a sharp, heavy scent. An older woman asked me, "You're not going?" I just shook my head. There's no room for me on that boat anymore. The taxi cut through the city. I looked at the palm trees, the faded signs, and listened to the driver's radio, which was playing an old country song. Time passes and we just keep getting older. I pressed my lips together. Time doesn't just make us old, it makes us invisible. When the car stopped in front of the house, I saw the wooden plaque I had carved for Ryan on his wedding day. The Millers. I thought it was a gift for their new beginning. Now, looking at it, the word Millers had faded, leaving only the rusty mark of a nail. I dragged the suitcase inside. I left the cruise ticket on the table and sat down. The evening light came through the window, lighting up my hands, dark and calloused from wood and sweat. The hands that had built houses, that had raised a son, now had nothing to do. I opened the phone and read the short message again. Just the family. I chuckled and said to myself, turns out Dad isn't family anymore. In that moment, something inside me broke. But at the same time, something else was born. Silent, hard, like a vein of old wood cracking open to reveal its core. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments below. I sat there all afternoon in the silent house, listening only to the slow whir of the ceiling fan, which seemed to be sighing. On the table, there was still a cup of cold coffee, the steam fogging the glass like a mist covering memories. I stared at the empty space in front of me and realized I didn't know what to do with the rest of my life. Ever since I retired, everything revolved around Ryan, my only son, my pride, and the reason I kept waking up every morning. I thought that when he started a family, when I saw him happy, my mission in life would be complete. But now, when he said, just the family, I understood that some missions never end. They just get erased by others. I went out onto the porch and watched the little street as the sun went down. Kids were playing catch in the street. Their laughter echoed. I remembered Ryan as a kid, running just like that, barefoot, his shirt stained with mud, laughing his head off. Every time he fell, he'd cry his eyes out, and I'd just tell him, "Get up, son. If you're gonna fall, fall on the dirt I worked." He always obeyed, always got back up, and I always believed I had taught him to be strong enough to never forget where he came from. I was wrong. I went into my old study. An old photo still hung on the wall. Me, Ryan, and my wife Rose on his college graduation day. Her smile in the photo seemed to be asking me, "See? Our boy is all grown up." I nodded and whispered to her picture. "He sure did, Rose. So grown up he forgot about his old man." I opened a drawer and pulled out the old notebook I used for taking measurements when I worked with wood. In between numbers and sketches, there were notes I'd written to myself. Don't bother the kids. Don't ask too much. Don't talk about the past. I didn't realize when I had started to sideline myself. Maybe it was ever since Sarah came into this house, bringing with her the smell of expensive perfume and rules I never quite understood. "Don't leave your tools in the living room, Dad. It looks messy." "Dad, don't give the kids so much candy." "Dad, you should just let us handle things." I would listen, nod, and smile. I thought that's just how living together was. I thought it was love. But no. It was how they taught me to make myself smaller to fit into their world. When the clock struck 6, I made myself more coffee, black. I looked at my hands, rough, calloused, the fingers that had held hammers and saws, that had put up roofs, carved wood, that had stroked my son's head. Now, those hands were shaking slightly, not from age, but from emptiness. I'd lived my whole life for other people, so much so that I forgot who I was. Outside, the sun had set completely. The city was sinking into a purple twilight. I poured the rest of the coffee onto the dirt by the porch. "Rose," I said quietly, "you know, I've never felt this house be so cold, not because people are missing, but because there's no place left for me." I closed the door and turned off the light. In the dark, my heartbeat was slow and heavy. I knew something was starting to change, something irreversible. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The first light of day was seeping through the curtains, painting the room a pale gray. I made coffee, took a sip, and sat down at my old desk. I hadn't slept at all. In my head, those 3 words echoed over and over. Just the family. Every time I thought them, I felt a pang in my heart, like a knife touching a wound that hadn't healed. I opened the wooden desk drawer, the one I'd kept locked since my days in the workshop. Inside, there were papers yellowed with time, invoices, receipts, some design sketches, and a dark blue file held together with a rubber band. On the cover, the words, "Ryan's House," written by me 6 years ago, the day I decided to buy my son his house. I remember that afternoon like it was yesterday. Ryan had just married Sarah. Both young, full of dreams and not much else. I had sold a piece of land I owned outside of town and pooled it with my retirement savings to make the down payment on this house. Ryan told me, "Dad, we'll put it in my name later. The paperwork is just a formality." I smiled, didn't give it a second thought. I trusted my son's word, just like any father would. Now, looking at the contract, the owner's name was still Ernesto Miller. My signature, scribbled but firm. Ryan's signature only appeared in the co-resident section. There was no clause stating I would transfer it to him. The house he lived in, the one he called his family home, was still completely 100% mine. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. A bittersweet and yet calm feeling washed over me. I didn't want to take anything back, but the truth, so clear and obvious, opened my eyes. They hadn't just left me out of a trip, they had left me out of my own life, while the very foundation of that life, every brick, every beam, every dollar, had been laid by my hands. I heard the wind rustle through the window. The contract fluttered slightly. I closed it, but my gaze stopped on the line that said, "Legal owner, Ernesto Miller." A quiet thought emerged in my mind. Maybe, for the first time in many years, I still had the power to decide something. I pulled out my cell phone and looked up the name of Mr. Davis, an old friend from my blue-collar days, now a semi-retired lawyer. When I heard his voice on the other end, I felt my heart steady. "Ernie, it's a miracle to hear from you. I need your help looking at something, Davis. It's about a property." I told him the story briefly. On the other end of the line, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "If the house is still in your name, Ernie, nobody can force you to transfer it. It's yours, legally, with full rights." I was silent. That simple sentence landed like a hammer blow on hardwood. Full rights. That word echoed in my chest. After the call, I stared out the window for a long time. Outside, the sun was already shining brightly. Kids were laughing in the street, And me, the man who had built so many houses for others, I realized I had let others take over my own home. But now, I still had a house in my name, and I had the truth. I was never weak. I was just too good. That afternoon, the sea breeze blew in, carrying the smell of salt and the distant echo of a ship's horn. Sitting on the porch, I watched the golden sunlight fall on the quiet street, thinking over and over about Davis's words. Full rights. Those two words repeated in my head, like the soft tapping of a hammer on wood, a constant, slow sound, but every tap woke up a part of me that had been asleep. I realized I hadn't lived like a man with his own will in a long, long time. Since Rose died, I had only existed in the roles of dad, grandpa, the one who helps. I always thought their happiness was my reward. But happiness, if there's no room for you in it, is just a room with a locked door. I remembered the time Ryan asked me for a loan to remodel the house. I took out my savings without a second thought. The time Sarah wanted new furniture, I built the cabinets and stained the tables myself. I was proud that they needed me, not knowing that my willingness to please made them forget I was a person with feelings too. I don't blame them. I taught them that way. I taught them I would always be there, that whatever they needed, I'd solve it. Now, they believed it so much they thought I'd be there forever, silent, ready to be forgotten. As the sun began to set behind the houses across the street, I got up and poured myself a small glass of bourbon. I don't drink much, but today it tasted different. Bitter at first, then warm in the center, and then it spread slowly, like fire in my veins. I looked at the carved wooden plaque on the wall, the one I made for my son when he started his own company. So you remember where you came from. Now, I was the one who needed to remember. I went into the study. I opened the blue file again and placed it slowly in the center of the desk. The years of work passed before my eyes like a movie. The calloused hands, the sound of the wood plane, the smell of paint, Rose's laugh every time I brought her a finished chair. I gently touched my signature in the bottom corner. Over the years, I had signed so many papers for others, school forms, insurance, loans, but this time I saw it clearly. This was the signature of a man who still had a little freedom left. I opened my phone and texted Davis, "I need to see you tomorrow. I want to talk about the process for selling the house." Then I turned the phone off. I didn't need to think anymore. As night fell, I sat alone in the living room. Outside, the waves crashed on the shore, a murmur like someone's distant breath. I remembered Rose, the smell of her hair, the way she'd put her hand on my shoulder and say, "Don't let anyone teach you to be small, Ernie. You were born to build, not to bend." I smiled to myself. I hadn't heard that voice in my head for years. Maybe she was always here. I'd just forgotten how to listen. I turned off the light and watched the darkness spread through the room, feeling a strange lightness in my heart. It wasn't peace, but a silent awakening, the kind that only comes once in a life, when you accept that loss isn't the end, but the chance to start building again. But this time, for yourself. The next morning, I drove my old truck to the outskirts of town, where my carpentry workshop used to be. The familiar road wound through rows of pine trees, the smell of resin and sun-baked dust mixed in the air. I hadn't been here in 2 years, not since I sold part of the land to help Ryan with the down payment on his new house. When I stopped the truck in front of the rusty iron gate, I felt a tightness in my chest. The wooden sign was still there, the letters Miller's Woodshop faded by time, but every stroke I'd carved with my knife years ago was still visible. I pushed the gate open and went inside. The smell of old wood and pine oil still hung in the air, mixed with the sound of the wind whistling through the tin roof, like a sigh from old memories. This place had been my whole world, the place where I taught my son to saw a straight line, to hammer with the right rhythm. The place where Rose brought me lunch every day, telling me neighborhood gossip while we ate. Now, all that was left was a thick layer of dust, scraps of wood, and the little chair I built for Ryan when he turned 6. I walked over to the chair and wiped the dust off the wooden surface. The legs were still firm. The engraved inscription, "For my son," with my own hands, was still legible. I remembered the day I finished it. He sat down, smiled, showing his baby teeth, and said, "Dad, when I grow up, I'm going to make you a bigger, prettier chair." I believed him. But time makes people forget the little promises. I walked through the workshop, touching every tool. The plane, the saw, the measuring tape. Everything was still in its place, only the layer of dust proved that nobody needed them anymore. I picked up a long pine board and brought it close to my face. The smell of living wood was still fragrant, so real it comforted my heart. I made a small cut with a utility knife and stopped, realizing my hand was still steady. Despite the years, these hands remembered every rhythm of the saw, every angle of the plane. They still had the strength to create something. Standing in the middle of the old workshop, I suddenly understood that for all these years, I had just been living as a tool. I created houses, cabinets, tables, chairs, and even a successful son, but I no longer knew how to build anything for myself. Now, this place was like a mirror reflecting me. Every piece of rotten wood, every crack, every rusty nail told the story of my life, the story of a man who had given himself completely to others, forgetting who he'd once been. I sat in the wooden chair where Rose used to sit and read while waiting for me to finish a piece. The light filtered through the tin roof, falling right on my hands, cracked but still strong. Suddenly, I heard her warm, deep voice in my head. "You've spent your whole life building houses for other people, Ernie. When are you going to rebuild the house of your own soul?" I lowered my head and looked at the board in my hand. That question stuck in my chest like a nail. I couldn't answer, but I knew I had heard it clearly. That afternoon, before I left the workshop, I wiped the dust off the Miller's woodshop sign. I thought maybe I'd come back tomorrow. Maybe I'd make a few things again, not for anyone else, just because I wanted to hear the echo of the wood again, to smell the living resin, and to feel that my hands still knew how to create something real. Before closing the gate, I took one last look. In the twilight, dust particles floated like thousands of fragments of memories, and I understood. This is the place where I lost myself, and it's also the place where I'll find myself again. That night, I returned home when it was almost dark. The city was as noisy as ever, but I felt like I was walking in a different kind of silence, the kind of silence that only comes when you've moved past the pain and started to see the truth. I took a shower, made myself a cup of mint tea, and sat by the window, looking out at the small street. It was drizzling, and the light from the street lamps reflected on the glass like shining veins running down the pane. I saw my reflection there, blurry, old, but still present. I took out the house file again. The line, "Owner Ernesto Miller," was still there, cold as a sentence, and at the same time, like a release. In my whole life, I never thought I'd have to use my rights to teach my son a lesson. But maybe this time it wasn't about teaching him, but about saving myself. Saving myself from a silence that had lasted too long, from the position of a father who is only mentioned when money or advice is needed. I turned on the desk lamp. I opened my old notebook. On the first page, a few lines from Rose were still written. "If you ever feel lost, stop and listen to the silence." I really listened. There was no ticking clock, no sound of cars, just the rain and my own breathing. And in that pause, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I met Davis at the old diner near the courthouse. He looked the same as ever, with his gray hair and bright eyes behind thick glasses. When he heard me say I wanted to sell the house, he frowned for a non-second. "Ernie, are you sure? That's your son's house." I stirred my coffee and answered slowly. "It's my house, Davis. I bought it. I paid for every cent. I just want to get back what I forgot to protect." He looked at me for a long time, and then he nodded, with a mixture of respect and compassion in his eyes. "I'll handle the paperwork. Do you want to keep this quiet?" "Yes. Until the time is right. They won't understand, at least not right now." We sat in silence. At the table next to us, a young couple was arguing about money, with that same harsh tone, just like Ryan and Sarah every time they talked about family expenses. I looked at them, thinking about the price of maturity that my son still didn't understand. On the way back, I stopped by the workshop. The gate was still padlocked, but I opened it, went inside, and sat in my old chair. I took a piece of scrap pine, and with a knife, I carved a small phrase. "Not all that is given is lost." I touched the letters, feeling every deep cut, and I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. In the afternoon, I went back home and opened the computer to send Davis a confirmation email. I typed the words very slowly. Please proceed with all necessary paperwork. I want to finalize the sale of the house within 2 weeks. I hit send and sat in silence for a long time. There was no thunder, no storm, just a strange calm inside me, as if I had just laid the first brick of a new house, a house I would build with the courage that had been dormant for years. That night, I slept peacefully. For the first time in months, I didn't dream of family dinners. I didn't hear the distant laughter of my grandkids, just the steady sound of the rain on the roof, a slow rhythm like a whisper. It's time, Ernie. It's time to stand up for yourself. 3 days later, I got a call from Davis. There's a young couple very interested in the house. They've got a cash offer. If you agree, we can close in 10 days. I was silent for a moment, listening to the sound of the waves coming from far away through the phone. Then I said, in a calm voice, "Go ahead. 10 days is enough." I hung up, but I felt like something was left undone. I needed to go back to that house, not to change my mind, but to face the place that had turned me into a stranger. The house I had built brick by brick, but where there wasn't a single corner for me. That afternoon, I went. The sun was soft and the wind carried the scent of honeysuckle from the neighbor's garden. I rang the bell once, twice. No one answered. They were on the cruise, just as planned. I took the spare key from my wallet, the one Ryan had given me years ago. "Just in case of an emergency, hold on to this, Dad." Yes, this was an emergency, but not in the way he'd imagined. I opened the door and went inside. The air in the house was strangely quiet. Sarah's familiar perfume still lingered on the sofa, mixed with the smell of new plastic from the furniture. The house was clean, tidy, with no trace of me. Family photos hung on the walls. Ryan, Sarah, the 2 kids, all smiling brightly. I looked at each frame carefully. I wasn't in a single one. I crossed the living room and touched the wooden cabinet I had given them for their wedding. It was still solid, beautiful, but now it was filled with modern, cold, steel-like ornaments. I smiled bitterly. I guess they don't like old things anymore. I went upstairs. The kids' room was still full of color. On the desk, there was a drawing by Julia, a house with 4 people, Dad, Mom, her brother, and her. Grandpa wasn't there. I looked at the drawing for a long time. I didn't feel sadness, just emptiness. Kids draw what they see, not what adults want them to imagine. As I was about to go downstairs, my gaze stopped at Ryan's study. The door wasn't locked. I went in. The smell of paper and air conditioning filled the room. On the desk was a pile of files, bills, and an envelope with a law firm's logo. I opened it. Inside was a draft of a property transfer contract with the grantor Ernesto Miller and the grantee Ryan Miller. The date on it was from 3 months ago. It just didn't have my signature yet. I read every line, and my heart sank slowly. They had the papers ready. They were just waiting for the right moment for when I softened up, or when they thought I wasn't lucid enough to refuse. Maybe Sarah was the one who pushed for it, but Ryan, my son, had silently agreed. And it was that silence that was the knife that cut the deepest. I folded the papers and put them in my shirt pocket, not to use as proof, but as a reminder. Never again be the blind man in the house I built myself. Before leaving, I stopped in the middle of the living room and took one last look. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting golden stripes of light on the wall like flames. I heard Rose's voice whispering in my mind. "It's time, Ernie. Don't just stand there watching." I nodded slightly. As I left the house, I closed the door, gently. No anger, no resentment, just a clarity as firm as a saw's cut through wood. My decision was made. The next morning, Davis called again, his voice full of energy, like he'd just closed a big deal. "The young couple wants to see you this afternoon. They loved the house and want to see it again to close the deal immediately." I listened, feeling nothing in particular. I just answered, "All right, I'll be there." I put on a white shirt, a light-colored jacket, and shaved carefully. Not to impress anyone, but because I wanted to face this with as much dignity as possible, like a man on his way to reclaim his own respect. I arrived early that afternoon. The house was just as it was the day before, silent, tidy, with no sign of life other than a few dry leaves the wind had blown onto the doorstep. I opened the door and all the windows to let the light in. The smell of old wood and essential oils mixed, a strange and familiar sensation. I walked through, not to inspect, but to say goodbye. When the young couple arrived, they were very young, surely not even 30. The husband introduced himself as David, a veterinarian. His wife, Claire, was an elementary school art teacher. They both spoke softly, with bright eyes and a kind smile. They walked through the house, whispering to each other, and every so often they'd laugh as they imagined their future here. "This house has such a warm energy, you know," Claire said, touching the banister. "It feels like someone loved it very much." I smiled, a sincere smile for the first time in months. Yes, there was a lot of love here. It's just, some love doesn't know how to stay. David nodded and said they were willing to pay in cash, no haggling. When Davis handed me the contract, I read every line carefully. Everything was legal, clear. He passed me a pen, and his voice turned more serious. "Ernie, do you want to think about it for one more day?" I looked at him and shook my head gently. "No need, Davis. There are some things that if you don't cut them, at the root, they'll keep eating you down to the bone." I signed. The tip of the pen glided over the paper firmly, decisively. When the last stroke of ink settled, I felt an immense relief in my chest, as if I had just dropped a boulder I had been carrying for half my life. Davis clapped me on the shoulder. "It's done, my friend. The money will be in your account in 2 days." Claire came over and took my hand gently. "Thank you truly. We will take care of this house with all our love." I looked at her and smiled. "Do what the previous ones forgot to do. Take care of the love and don't let anyone feel left out." After they left, I stayed a little longer. The shadow of dusk was stretching through the window, bathing the room in a pale, golden light. I walked down the hall, gently touching the walls. Under the new paint, I could still feel the old cracks, as if the house's memories refused to disappear. I said quietly, as if speaking to myself, "Thank you for being a roof for them. Now you have new owners, and I'm about to start over too." As I left, I locked the door very slowly without looking back. The sound of the lock turning resonated softly in my hand, but in my heart, it was the sound of something opening. I wasn't abandoning the past. I was just stopping living in it. The sunset was falling, and the wind rustled my hair, carrying the smell of salt water. I looked up, and for the first time in many years, I felt that the sky was immense. I knew I had done the right thing, not out of spite, but because finally, I had chosen myself. I spent that whole night writing, not because I needed to explain myself, but because I knew that when Ryan returned, he deserved to hear the truth, even if it was late. I sat at my old wooden table, under the dim yellow light of a lamp, with a blank sheet of paper in front of me. The pen trembled slightly in my hand, not from age, but because I knew that every word I wrote would cut a tie that I had bound around my own heart for my entire life. I wrote slowly, every line clear. "Ryan, you once said that I should let you have your own space, that the family needed to set healthy boundaries. I understood, and now I'm doing exactly that. I'm respecting your space by getting out of it. This house, as you well know, was mine. I never demanded anything because I thought love was more important than paperwork. But maybe it was because I believed that you all forgot that my name is on everything I did, not just on a document, but in my blood and on every callus on my hands. When you sent me the just the family message, I understood that I was no longer part of your world. There's no anger, no resentment, just realization. I sold this house not for revenge, but to restore the proper order of things. No one can live forever in a house where they are treated like a guest. Your belongings have been moved to a storage unit. I've already paid for the first 3 months. Contact Mr. Davis when you need to retrieve them. I don't want you to look for me. Just consider that I'm starting over, just like when I began this life with empty hands. Teach the kids what you forgot, that kindness isn't weakness, and silence doesn't mean you agree to be stepped on. You have 3 months to start over. just like me. Ernie. I set the pen down and looked at the last line. The ink hadn't dried yet and started to bleed slightly from a drop of water. I couldn't tell if it was from the tea or from my own eyes. I folded the letter and put it in an envelope. On the outside, I wrote only 3 words. For my son. Early the next morning, I went back to the house one last time. The sun was barely up, the light was pale, and the street was deserted. I opened the door, went inside, and the smell of orange essential oil still hung in the air. I placed the envelope on the dining room table, right in the center, where they would surely see it when they arrived. Beside it, I left a copy of the sales contract, the keys, and a small note with the address of the storage unit. I stood there, looking at the room for a long time. Everything was the same, but suddenly it seemed strangely small. This house had been the symbol of my pride, my sacrifice, and a father's love. Now, it was just 4 cold walls that housed forgetfulness. Before I left, I looked at the family photo on the wall. I wasn't in it, but I didn't feel sadness. Maybe sometimes you have to disappear from the picture so others realize who was holding the frame up. I closed the door, threw the deadbolt, and turned to leave. The morning breeze rustled my hair, carrying a soft smell of salt water. In my hand, a bus ticket to Asheville, North Carolina, was folded in my shirt pocket. This time, I was embarking on my own journey. No invitation, no one to see me off. Behind me, my son's house was bathed in the dawn light. In front of me, the road opened up, silent but full of promise. And in my heart, I heard a familiar voice, Rose's voice. You did the right thing, Ernie. Finally, you remembered who you are. The bus left the city just as the sun peeked over the horizon. Through the window, I watched the buildings, the signs, and the familiar street fade away, like pieces of the life I was leaving behind. I didn't know if I was running away or returning. I just knew this road was taking me to Asheville, the place where I had started my life as a carpenter, and maybe the place where I would learn to live again, no longer for anyone else. 3 hours later, the bus stopped in front of a small, pale yellow house tucked away on an old cobblestone street. The wooden sign hanging at the entrance had faded letters, but you could still read, Manny's Workshop. I smiled. Manny, my old friend, the one who taught me the trade, was retired now too. When I called to tell him I was coming, he just said, Come on down. There's still room here for those of us who haven't tired out yet. Manny met me at the door, thin, with gray hair and the same kind-hearted smile as always. He clapped me on the shoulder. Ernie, you finally remembered the way back. Maybe I never left, Manny. Maybe I just forgot how to return. He laughed and led me into the workshop. The smell of new wood and pine oil filled the air, and the sound of hammers and saws echoed steadily like the heartbeat of the past. I stood still for a moment, breathing deep, feeling how every fiber of wood in the air touched my memories. You need work? Manny asked. I nodded. I don't need money. I just need to work with my hands again. That's enough. Around here, the man who gets his hands back lives a second time. The first day, I just sat sharpening blades and cutting scrap wood to the right size. The sound of the blade sliding over the wood brought me a strange calm. No one asked why I had come. No one pitied me or asked for explanations. They all just called me Mr. Ernie, as if I'd never lost anything. In the afternoon, I rented a small room right behind the workshop. 4 white-painted walls, a single iron bed, and a small window that looked out on a row of cacti. When the evening light came through the window, lighting up the wooden table, I felt something I had forgotten long ago. The peace of solitude. No one was calling. There were no text messages, no, Dad, can you help me with something? Just the chirping of crickets in the yard and the smell of fresh resin on my clothes. That night, I opened my notebook again. On the last page, I added a line. Today, I started over, not with a house, but with my hands. I closed the notebook. I turned off the light and lay down. The wind slipped through the window, soft as Rose's breath. I closed my eyes and whispered, See? I finally did what I should have done a long time ago. In my first dream in Asheville, I didn't dream of Ryan or the house I had sold. I just saw myself sitting in the workshop, with the light shining through the floating wood dust, and my hands, those old hands, creating something beautiful once again. Far away, the cruise ship had probably already reached its destination, and I, the abandoned father, had just arrived at mine. Not on a luxury trip, but in my own life. 11 days later, I was in the workshop with Manny, sanding a large oak board, when I heard a car stop abruptly outside. The door slammed, and then there were hurried footsteps. I looked up, and before I could say anything, Ryan appeared in the doorway. His face was tan from the sun, his eyes bloodshot, a mixture of anger and confusion. "Dad, what are you doing?" he blurted out, his voice shaking but loaded with anger. "You sold our house? Without telling anyone, without warning, without giving me any chance?" I put down the sandpaper, wiped my hands on my carpenter's apron, and pointed to a nearby chair. "Sit down, Ryan. Let's talk like decent people." "No, I can't sit down," he shouted. "You left us with nothing." Manny, who had been silent in a corner of the workshop, quietly stepped out, leaving me alone with my son amid the smell of pine resin and the whistling wind. I looked at Ryan, trying to stay calm. "That house wasn't yours, Ryan. It was mine. I bought it. I paid for every cent. You were just living there. And now, I needed it for me." "Living there?" he repeated, his voice choking. "You talk as if we were parasites. Me, Sarah, my kids. We lived there. We made it a home. You can't just destroy everything because you're angry." I sighed softly. No anger, just sadness. "Angry? No, Ryan. This isn't anger. This is a boundary. A boundary I should have set a long time ago." He let out a bitter laugh. "A boundary? Abandoning me and your grandkids, and you call that a boundary?" I looked him straight in the eye. "Remember the day at the port? The message you sent me? Just the family? You taught me that lesson, Ryan. I'm just following your example." The whole workshop went silent. Ryan looked down, clenching his fists. I saw the veins in his neck pulse. His lips trembled, but no words came out. Finally, he said in a low voice, almost a whisper, "I didn't mean it like that, Dad. Sarah just thought, she thought the trip should be more private." "More private?" I interrupted. "You mean without me? You mean cutting out the person who carried a whole life on his back so you could have what you call privacy?" He looked at me, a mix of guilt and helplessness. "You don't understand, Dad. I just wanted some peace. Sarah doesn't like people getting in her business." I smiled slightly. My voice was hoarse but clear. "Turns out I'm the intrusion in the house that I bought. Ryan, I don't want to argue, but you have to understand. If you can't stand up for the man who gave you your life, you'll never be able to protect the family you're trying so hard to keep." He fell silent. A few seconds later, his voice broke. "So where are we supposed to live now? Did you think about the kids?" That question made me close my eyes. A sentence that sounded like love but was really just an old knife. I opened my eyes and said slowly, "Yes, I did think. I paid for 3 months of storage, enough time for you to find a new place, and I thought about the kids too. I thought they should learn to treat their grandfather with affection, not with fake politeness." Ryan let out a sigh and collapsed into the chair. In the dim light of the workshop, he looked smaller, like the boy from long ago who had just gotten in trouble. I walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "I don't hate you, Ryan. But you have to understand, I'm no longer willing to live as a shadow in your house." He looked up, his eyes wet. "Sarah, she's a wreck. She says you were cruel." I nodded slightly. "Maybe. But sometimes, cruelty is the only thing left when you want to be respected." Ryan lowered his head, saying no more. A moment later, he stood up and walked silently to the door. As his figure disappeared behind the cacti, I felt my own heart pounding, not with anger, but with compassion. Compassion for his son who still didn't understand that sometimes losing is the only way to learn how to hold on. We should review. Let's review together before continuing. Is the plot consistent? Do the story details follow the original plan and outline? Are the dates, places, and events consistent with the original outline? The next day, calm returned to the workshop. I arrived early, opened the gates, organized the workbench, and started working as usual. But all morning, Ryan's face from the night before stayed in my mind. angry, scared, and unable to understand what was happening. As a father, you always want to hug your son, even when he's just hurt you. But this time, I knew that if I hugged him right away, everything would go back to the way it was, a vicious cycle of resignation and being forgotten. At noon, Manny brought me a coffee and set it in front of me. "He came by?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, he came by." Very angry, but also confused. Manny took a sip of his coffee and said in his deep voice, "Every son has to take a good fall to learn that his father isn't a god. Let him be, Ernie. A strong wind always calms down eventually." I smiled without answering. Every father knows there are times when silence is the only answer. In the afternoon, Ryan called. I saw the familiar name flash on the screen and let it ring until it went to voicemail. 3 minutes later, it rang again. I still didn't answer. The third call, the fourth. I just watched, without moving. For the first time in my life, I left my son waiting without an explanation. Not out of spite, but because I knew that if I talked right then, he would listen without understanding. That night, the texts started. "Dad, we have nowhere to live. I know I messed up, but don't do this. Dad, I don't want to lose you." I read them all without replying. I left the phone on the table. I got up and went out to the porch. The night breeze blew in from the fields, cool. The moon was high. Its silver light spread over the yard, which was full of sawdust. I looked at my hands, the hands that had taught Ryan everything, from how to hold a nail and measure accurately to how to face his mistakes. Now I was teaching him one more lesson, the lesson of consequences. The next day, the messages continued. "Sarah wants to talk. She hasn't stopped crying. Dad, the kids are asking why Grandpa isn't at home." I picked up the phone and whispered to myself, "Because Grandpa doesn't have a home there anymore, kids." Then I put the phone in a drawer and went back to the wooden board I was working on. I planed it, stroke by stroke. The sound of the blade sliding over the surface was a rhythmic whisper, like breathing. Each pass of the plane seemed to relieve something inside me. In the afternoon, I saw Ryan appear at the entrance. He had dark circles under his eyes and walked heavily. I didn't say anything. I just motioned with my head for him to sit down. He was quiet for a while, and then he spoke, his voice hoarse. "Dad, I'm not here to ask for the house back. I just want to understand why you're not saying anything." I looked up and held his gaze for a long moment, because there are things that, the more you talk about them, the further away they get. You didn't want to listen, Ryan. You just wanted to argue. I was like that with your grandfather, and now you're like that with me. He lowered his head, fiddling with some keys in his hand, and his voice softened. "I feel so empty, Dad. Like I've lost something I can't get back." "You didn't lose it, Ryan. You just never learned how to hold on to it." I walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "I don't hate you, but I need you to understand that I am no longer the one who's always willing to take it. Sometimes, the silence is so you can hear your own heart." Ryan nodded, his eyes red. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know I was wrong, but I still feel scared." "Scared of losing what was familiar?" I asked. "Then now you understand me. I carried that feeling for years while you were pushing me out of your life." There was nothing more to say. He sat there, head down, while I went back to my table and continued planing the wood. In the air, there was only the soft, steady scraping of the tool, like a prayer. When Ryan got up to leave, he stopped at the door, looked around the workshop, and said quietly, "It still smells like wood in here. The same as when I was a kid. Right, Dad?" I replied, "Yeah, it's the smell of real things. As long as you still remember that, I don't regret anything." When his figure disappeared out the door, I sighed. I knew the storm had passed, but the calm that comes after is the real challenge. In the quiet of the workshop, I heard my heart speak more clearly than ever. Silence isn't an escape. It's the way we both get to grow up. In the following days, I slowly got used to the rhythm of life in Asheville. Every morning, the church bells echoed in the distance, mixing with the sound of saws and hammers in the workshop. Manny used to joke, "Around here, anyone who hears the sound of a wood plane and feels happy." Well, They can consider themselves saved. I would smile because it was true. Every pass of the plane took a little more of the weight off my shoulders. I started taking on small jobs, making chairs, tables, repairing doors for families in the area. The customers called me Mr. Ernie, and I liked the way they said it, with a touch of respect, no pity. Every time my hands touched the wood, I remembered my youth. When Ryan was little and would sit next to me, playing with nails or asking innocent questions like, "Dad, why does the wood stay still?" I used to answer, "Because someone is holding it in place." Now, thinking about it, I was the one who had forgotten to hold my own place in my son's life. One afternoon, while I was planing an old door, Manny came over with a newspaper in his hand. He put it on the table and said, "Someone's looking for you. Ryan Miller. Is that your boy? He called me this morning asking if I knew where you were." I stopped, the plane still in my hand. "What did you tell him?" "I just told him if he really wanted to see you, he should find you himself. Every father leaves footprints in the places that once belonged to him." I was silent. That sentence moved me. I knew Ryan would come sooner or later. And next time, maybe he wouldn't come to unleash his anger. At sunset, I sat on the porch, watching the last light of the day slide over the distant hills. My hands ached, but I felt an inner peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. At 65, I had nothing left to prove. I just wanted to live honestly. And in every crack of the wood, I recognized something that I hadn't understood my whole life. True freedom comes when we stop trying to be loved and we start loving our own solitude. A week later, a group of young guys came to the workshop asking to learn the trade. The oldest was 19, the youngest barely 15. I asked them, "Why do you want to learn this trade?" One of them answered, "Because nobody teaches it around here, and we need to work." I looked at their eyes, clear, direct, and I nodded. "All right, but it's hard work. Wood isn't easy to tame." They smiled and said in unison, "Yes, sir, we can take it." From that day on, the workshop was filled with life. The sound of saws and hammers mixed with their laughter. I felt younger. Once, Manny looked at me, half joking, half serious. "You don't need your son, Ernie. You've got a whole gang of adopted sons now." "DIL," I smiled, looking at the sweaty apprentices as they assembled a chair frame. "No, Manny. Every father needs his son. You just have to wait for them to really grow up before you can find each other again." That night, I wrote a few lines in my journal. Ryan hasn't come back, but I'm not waiting for him anymore. When he finds his own path, he'll know where his father is, in everything he ever touched, in the smell of the wood, in the silent sound of his own heart. I put the pen down and looked out at the porch. The summer rain was starting to fall, pattering on the tin roof. I lifted my face and breathed deep. The smell of damp earth and fresh wood mixed, intense but soft. I smiled. Maybe this was happiness. Not that others understand you, but that, finally, you understand yourself. That morning, just as I was opening the workshop doors, Manny told me quietly, "Ernie, I think someone's been at the gate since real early." I looked up and saw Ryan. He was much thinner, with dark circles under his eyes, his clothes wrinkled, with the tired look of someone who had just walked through a storm. I wasn't surprised. I just took off my apron in silence, wiped my hands, and went out to meet him. "Dad," he said, his voice hoarse as if he'd been walking all night, "I don't know if I still have the right to call you that." I didn't answer. I just nodded toward the wooden chairs near the porch. He understood the gesture and sat down. We were silent for a long time, listening only to the sound of the wood plane and the smell of pine resin floating in the air. Finally, Ryan spoke. "I have nothing left, Dad. I lost the house. The company went under. Patricia. She went to live with her mom for a while." I kept my tone calm. "You still have your hands." He let out a bitter, tired laugh. "These hands. They don't know how to do anything but type on a phone and sign contracts." I turned toward the workshop and pointed to a half-finished wooden table. "I have work. If you want, you can help. There's no salary, just sweat." Ryan looked at me with a mixture of surprise and shame, but then he stood up and followed me slowly. I gave him a wooden board and took his hand to correct his stance with the saw. "Easy. Let the blade find its own path. Wood is like people. If you force it, it breaks. Ryan nodded and followed my instructions in silence. The saw screeched, clumsy at first, then more constant. I stood beside him, listening to every rhythm as if I were listening to his heartbeat as a child, sitting in a corner of the workshop, looking up every once in a while to ask, "Dad, am I doing it right?" He wasn't asking now, but I could clearly see a regret in his eyes that didn't need words. When the last piece of wood separated, he was breathing hard, his hands shaking. I passed him a towel. "Your hands will hurt for a few days, but then they'll remember, just like your heart." He smiled slightly, his eyes red. "Dad, I've been such a fool. I always thought you needed to be by my side to feel useful. I didn't understand that I was the one who needed you so I wouldn't get lost." I looked at him and answered softly, "Nobody is born knowing how to be a father or a son, Ryan. We both have to learn. And sometimes that lesson comes late." At noon, we ate together. Just plain rice, grilled fish, and some vegetables. He ate slowly, in silence. I noticed that from time to time he would look around the workshop with a lost look, as if remembering the old days. When we finished eating, he said, "I want to stay here for a while. Will you let me?" I nodded. "If you stay, you work. If you work, you live. But remember, this isn't a place to run away. It's a place to start over." At dusk, father and son cleaned the workshop. The last light of day illuminated the wood dust, which glowed like a golden mist. In that moment, I realized that the anger inside me had dissipated without me even noticing. In its place was a soft compassion, a love that was no longer stained with expectations. Just truth. That night, Ryan sat on the porch, looking at the sky, and said quietly, "I don't know if I can ever make up for my mistake, Dad." I answered in a deep voice, "Don't make up for it. Live differently. Mistakes don't need to be paid for. They just need to not be repeated." He turned to look at me, his eyes brighter. I saw something in him that I hadn't seen in my son in years, humility. I smiled and poured us both a small glass of corn whiskey. "Drink, Ryan. This is the first time you and I are drinking together, not to forget, but to remember." In the silent night, the words father and son echoed softly, like a prayer, and I knew that the storm in my heart was finally beginning to calm. Ever since Ryan stayed, the workshop seemed to come alive again. In the morning, before the sun peeked over the rooftops, the sound of the wood plane was already echoing steadily. At first, he was clumsy. The saw would go crooked, the nails would bend, and his hands were covered in blisters from not being used to the work. But he didn't complain. Every time I looked over, he just pressed his lips together and kept working. Sometimes I saw in him a reflection of myself when I was young. A man learning to stand on his own 2 feet, through his own 2 hands. Manny would smile and say, "The boy can handle hard work, Ernie. Maybe he's more like you than you think." I wouldn't answer. I'd just nod. I knew that between a father and a son, the resemblance isn't in the blood. It's in the shared pain. One afternoon, under a blazing sun, Ryan was varnishing a cabinet. Sweat was running down his neck, soaking his back. I gave him a bottle of water. He took it, drank it down in one go, and then asked, "Dad, have you ever regretted selling the house?" Gee. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and looked out at the distant fields. No. Some things have to be lost so people realize what they had. If I hadn't sold it, you'd still think that house was something you deserved. He lowered his head, silent. He knew my words weren't a reproach, but a way for him to hear himself. Later that afternoon, Ryan dropped a hammer and hit his finger. Blood started to gush. I passed him the first aid kit and said, "Stop the bleeding. The wood feels the pain, and so do our hands." He smiled slightly, his voice shaking. "So, this has happened to you a lot, too." I looked at my 10 fingers, covered in scars, and smiled gently. Everyone is a mistake, but if you're afraid of the pain, you'll never build anything that lasts. That night we had dinner with Manny. He looked at both of us and said, "Maybe it wasn't a loss losing the house. What's valuable is this." He pointed to the newly finished wooden table. It was built by 2 generations. Ryan looked at me, gratitude in his eyes. I felt a warmth in my heart. Maybe this was the only way we could talk, without needing to ask for forgiveness. That night, I taught Ryan how to carve letters into wood. I showed him how to hold the knife, sliding the steel blade slowly along the lines. Carving letters is like living. If you rush, the wood splinters. If you hesitate, the line is crooked. You have to be steady and know when to stop. He did it with concentration. Sweat dripped onto the board. When he finished, he turned to me. "What should I carve here, Dad?" I looked at him and smiled. "Rebirth." "Very good, son." We stared at the board for a long time. Suddenly I realized that between the chirping of the crickets and the smell of wood resin, the distance between father and son had shrunk to a simple sigh. We didn't need to talk much anymore, just work together, be silent together. That night, before turning off the light, I wrote in my notebook, "Today, Ryan created his first piece with his own hands. No demands, no evasions, just work and silence. The only language two real men understand." One morning in early fall, as the wind blew through the cacti in front of the workshop, I received a thick envelope with Sarah's handwriting. Her calligraphy was still elegant, but now the strokes seemed shaky, lacking the arrogant confidence I remembered. I sat at a wooden table and opened the letter slowly. A faint scent of perfume reminded me of those distant nights when I sat watching them eat dinner while they didn't say a word to me. "Dear Ernie, I'm writing this letter not to ask you to give us the house back, but to earn back the respect I lost. I understand that I crossed a line. When I advised Ryan to put distance between you, I thought I was protecting my small family. I didn't realize that I was breaking the larger family we belong to. The house is gone, but the consequences of hurtful words remain. Ryan can't sleep anymore. He works with you, learns to use his hands, and every night he tells me stories about the workshop. He says that, for the first time in his life, he feels like he's doing something real. I know an apology isn't enough, but please, believe me, we are changing." I folded the letter and sat in silence for a long time. There was no anger left in my chest, just a sadness as light as the wind. I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness, I thought. You can't write it in ink. It has to be carved day by day with actions. That afternoon, Ryan arrived early with a paper bag in his hand. He put a freshly baked pie on the table and smiled shyly. "Sarah made it. She said Dad likes apple pie." I looked at the pie and smiled slightly. "She does have a good memory. Did you read the letter?" "Yes, she's on the right path." He sat down and said in a serious voice, "I don't know when you'll forgive us." I looked at my son and said slowly, "Forgiving isn't forgetting, Ryan. It's how you stop carrying a weight. I'm not angry, but I'm not in a hurry to forget either. Everything takes time, like wood drying. If you rush it, it cracks." Ryan nodded, silent. I saw that he understood. He really understood. That night I took out my notebook and added a few lines. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give to others. It's the peace you give to yourself. They've started to learn again, and so have I. After writing, I got up and went out to the porch. The Asheville sky was full of stars that night, and the wind brought the smell of freshly cut wood. I felt light, as if a part of the past was healing. Ryan came out of the workshop with a half-carved board in his hand and asked, "Dad, what word should I carve now?" I looked at him and smiled. Forgiveness. Not to give it to anyone, but to remember that we, too, have needed to be forgiven. That night, the sound of the knife carving the wood echoed steadily. Each stroke shone under the lamp's light, as if it were being engraved on my own heart. There was no resentment left, just the lesson of being at peace. Time passed, soft as the wind. Winter in Asheville arrived, but it wasn't harsh, just enough for the mornings to have a light mist over the workshop roof. Ryan and I continued to work together every day. He wasn't clumsy anymore. Now he knew how to listen to the wood. He knew how to read its grain to choose the direction of the plane, and he knew when to stop in time to preserve its natural shape. I spoke little. I just observed. Some things don't need praise. You just have to see them to understand. One afternoon, Manny came in, laughing his head off. "Ernie, your son is a real professional now. I passed through town and heard people praising the furniture from his workshop. They're calling it the Miller style." I smiled, but Ryan stayed silent, looking at me. "I didn't think people would mention your name, Dad," he said quietly. "I thought you just wanted to hide behind the workshop." I wiped my hands and replied, Hiding is different from being forgotten, Ryan. I was forgotten, and I don't want that to happen to anyone in this family ever again. That afternoon, Ryan suggested opening a small shop next to the workshop to sell the furniture we made. I was silent. I just nodded. A month later, a sign was installed. Ernie's Workshop. For the first time in my life, my name was written in big letters in the center, not in anyone's shadow. When Ryan turned on the lights and the letters lit up, I just stared, unable to say anything. Inside my chest, something blossomed. It wasn't pride. It was the feeling of being seen. Customers started coming more often, mostly local folks. They called me Mr. Ernie and Ryan, the master's son. I saw how his eyes lit up every time he heard someone refer to his father with respect. One day, he approached me, put a hand on my shoulder, and said with a warm voice, "I used to be ashamed to be called the carpenter's son. Now I'm proud of it." I smiled and replied in a low voice, "You know, I never wanted you to follow my trade. I just wanted you to understand that everything that lasts is built with your hands, with honesty, not with fame." That night, when the workshop closed, Ryan took a thick board and carved a new phrase. Ernie, the man who taught how to build without breaking. I read those words and felt a lump in my throat. It had been many years since anyone had spoken of me that way. That night, Ryan brought some bourbon to the porch. We sat in silence, listening to the wind whistle through the roof tiles. He said, "Dad, I think I'm starting to understand the meaning of loss. I used to be afraid of it. But maybe it's what taught me to value things," I replied, in a voice that was deep but warm. "No one grows up without losing something, son. The important thing is what you choose to rebuild with after the loss." Ryan nodded. In the dim light, I saw him smile, the smile of a man who had found his way back, and in that moment, I understood that the forgotten father was now seen, not by the world, but by his own son. The following spring, Asheville was filled with yellow flowers along the cobblestone paths. In the morning, I would sit on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, listening to the sound of a saw in the distance. Ryan had arrived early at the workshop, along with the group of young apprentices we had accepted months ago. Now he was no longer the apprentice. He was teaching others with the same lessons he had learned in silence and error. I watched him and saw a reflection of myself years ago, but more serene, wiser about when to stop. One day, Mason, my grandson, came to visit with Sarah. The boy ran to me and hugged me, giving me a kiss on the cheek. "Grandpa, I missed you so much." I stroked his head, smiling. "It's been a long time since I've seen this boy. You've grown a ton." Sarah stood silently for a moment and then said quietly, "Ernie, thank you for letting Ryan come back and for giving us a chance to fix our mistakes." I looked at her and said, my voice as soft as the wind, "I didn't let him do anything. Everyone finds their own path, but I'm glad you found the right direction." Ryan came out of the workshop, wiped his hands, and when he saw his wife and son, his eyes lit up. He walked over, put his arm around Sarah, and then turned to me. "Dad, I want you to see something." He took me inside the workshop and pointed to the main wall, a large wooden plaque with a carved inscription. "You don't inherit blood. You inherit the hands that know how to build." I read it in silence. Those words sank into my heart, but they didn't hurt. They just filled me with warmth. Ryan continued, his voice choked. "I want my kids to grow up understanding that love isn't just about being close, it's about respect. Thank you, Dad, for not abandoning me, even when I abandoned you first." I put a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "I never abandoned you, Ryan. It's just that sometimes you have to step away so you can see clearly where you're going." The workshop fell silent. The wind was blowing, and the smell of pine resin mixed with the sun. Sarah watched us with tears in her eyes. In the afternoon, the whole family ate together in the middle of the workshop. The kids ran around, laughing their heads off. I sat and watched them, my heart light. It had been a long time since that laughter had sounded so genuine, without the shadow of debt or appearances. It was just a family, in the true sense of the word. After the meal, Ryan handed me a ticket. Dad, Sarah and I bought this for you. It's a wood sculpting course in Vermont. It's only 3 weeks. You said you wanted to learn more. Now's the time. I looked at the ticket and smiled. So, you're kicking me out again? Everyone laughed. Sarah said, no, it's a send-off, but this time, with all our love. I nodded, my heart warm. As the sunset fell, bathing the workshop in a golden light, I looked at the Ernie's Workshop sign again. I didn't see any pain in it anymore, just a simple pride. I took a sip of coffee and said quietly to myself, in the end, it wasn't in vain. A whole life being a father. And among the echoing laughter of the children, I thought I heard Rose whispering somewhere, carried on the wind. See, Ernie? Finally, the house has been rebuilt. If this story captivated you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box to the left of the screen. Thanks for watching.